Two men are standing at the same block party, three houses apart, and you would guess their bank accounts backwards if someone made you bet. This video is about why that guess is almost always wrong, and why the wrongness follows a pattern nobody points out to you. There's a second thing happening at this party too, something with Dale's own brother, that we won't get to until the end, and it's the part that actually proves how far any of this goes. You've made this exact guess before. Everyone has. New truck, nice watch, good story. Your brain files that as doing well in under a second, without asking for a single receipt, without pausing to consider that the watch could be financed and the truck could be three payments from repossession. This isn't a flaw in you specifically. It's how the guess gets made by almost everyone, almost every time, and it's wrong often enough that it's worth actually examining instead of trusting on reflex. Call the first man Greg. New truck in the driveway, the kind with the temporary paper plates still taped in the window. Nice watch, the kind you notice without meaning to. He's telling a story right now about a weekend trip that involved a very good hotel, and the story is already getting slightly better with each retelling. Call the second man Dale. Same block, same job title at competing companies, same rough salary for the last 11 years. He's wearing a shirt he's had since a wedding in 2019. His car is parked around the corner because it doesn't quite fit the image of the street, and some small part of him still notices that, even though it doesn't bother him the way it used to. Greg has $41,000 saved, total, across everything. Dale has $630,000. Read that again because it's backwards from what the driveway told you. This isn't about willpower and it isn't about Dale being smarter. It's about five habits, and every single one of them is invisible from where you're standing at a block party sizing people up in about 4 seconds. Habit 1. Greg buys the truck to announce something. Dale buys reliability and never mentions the purchase to anyone. When Greg's transmission needs work next year, it goes on a card. When Dale's does, it comes out of an account that exists for exactly this and nothing else. There's a mechanism underneath this that's worth naming directly. Economists call it social signaling, spending specifically to communicate status to people around you, and it's remarkably effective at doing that one job and almost nothing else. The truck signals, it doesn't compound. But here's the part that doesn't get said enough, and it's worth being honest about. Signaling isn't irrational. Greg gets something real from that truck every single day, a version of respect that arrives instantly and doesn't require anyone to know his account balance. Dale doesn't get that. Dale's version of respect, if it ever comes, arrives decades late and mostly from himself. Habit 2. Watch what happens when something goes wrong for each of them. Greg tells everyone, the story becomes currency, sympathy becomes a kind of social capital he can spend at dinner, retold with slightly more damage each time until the pipe that burst becomes the pipe that nearly flooded the whole basement, and by the third, telling there's a new detail about how close it came to reaching the electrical panel. Dale handles it and mentions it to nobody, not because he's private in some noble sense, but because the story was never going to make him feel better. It was just going to make the problem more real by repeating it out loud. His plumber gets paid from an account labeled "nothing more interesting than house," and by dinner that night he's already forgotten the amount, genuinely, not performing for getting for anyone's benefit. No drama, no audience, no repeat performance. Habit 3, and this is the one that actually separates the two accounts over time. Greg treats a raise as new spending capacity, automatically, the way water finds the lowest point in a room. Dale treats a raise as something that happens somewhere he doesn't check very often. The raise arrives, the transfer amount adjusts by the same percentage, and Dale's actual daily life stays almost exactly the way it was the week before. There's a real cost buried in habit 3 that doesn't get talked about at the block party either. Dale has been quietly turning down small pleasures for 11 years. Not big sacrifices, small ones, repeated. The nicer hotel, the newer phone the day it comes out instead of 2 years later, the upgraded seat on a flight he's taken 4 times this year alone, always in the same middle row, always telling himself the extra leg room isn't worth what it costs. He's not immune to wanting those things. He's just decided the $630,000 mattered more than any single one of them, and some weeks that decision is easier to live with than others. There are Fridays, usually after a long one at work, when the thought crosses his mind that he could just stop deciding this way for one night, order the good takeout, book the better room next time, and nothing catastrophic would happen. He thinks it, he rarely acts on it. That gap between the thought and the action is the whole habit, repeated so many times it stopped requiring effort somewhere around year 6. Habit 4, and here's where being a target becomes a real risk, not a moral judgment. Greg is an easier mark for exactly the people whose job is finding easy marks. The dealership finance manager reads the truck and the watch in about 4 seconds and prices the offer accordingly. The relative who needs a loan picks the neighbor who obviously has it, not the one parked around the corner. The contractor quotes differently depending on the driveway, and none of that requires malice from anyone involved. It's just where attention goes when you've spent years attracting it on purpose. No target, no envy, no ask. None of this happens in a vacuum either. Every commercial Greg has watched his whole life taught him, without ever saying it directly, that the truck is the proof and the vacation photo is the receipt. Nobody ever made a commercial about the account labeled house that nobody sees. There's no billboard for automatic transfers. The entire visible economy of advertising is built to reward exactly the habits that keep Greg's number where it is, and to make Dale's approach look, at a glance, like he's simply not participating in success. Last spring, a contractor quoted Greg $11,000 for a deck that should have run closer to 8, and Greg didn't blink because the number felt roughly right for a man who drives what Greg drives. The same contractor quoting a smaller job for Dale a month later off the same street priced it fairly without thinking twice, because nothing about Dale's car or clothes gave him a reason to guess high. Neither man ever compared notes, neither of them ever will. Habit 5, and this might be the quietest one of all. Greg negotiates almost everything down, reflexively, even when the amount barely matters because some part of him is always slightly worried the money won't be there later. Dale rarely negotiates anything, not because he doesn't notice a bad price, but because the friction of the conversation costs him more than most of the differences are worth, and he's stopped needing to prove he caught it. You've stood in a version of that driveway too, on either side of it. Maybe you were Greg for a season, buying the thing that announced something you weren't sure was true yet. Maybe you were Dale, sitting in the car parked around the corner, telling yourself the distance didn't bother you when it did. A little. Some Tuesdays more than others. You've probably done a small version of habit 1 or 3 yourself, sometime in the last month. Most people have. That's not a confession, it's just how the mechanism is built to work on everyone standing at that block party, Greg and Dale included. Here's the moment with the brother. Dale's older brother assumed a few years back that Dale was struggling, based on nothing more than the car and the shirt, and quietly offered to help cover a car repair bill without being asked. It happened over coffee at their mother's kitchen table, the same table both of them grew up doing homework at, and the offer came so gently, so naturally, that correcting it in the moment would have felt almost cruel, like refusing a gift wrapped with real care. Dale let him believe that was necessary. He paid him back in small amounts over 5 months just to keep the story consistent, transferring a little at a time under the vague explanation of finally getting around to it, and never once corrected the record. He still isn't fully sure that was the right call, and some years later it still crosses his mind at family gatherings, usually right around the moment his brother mentions it again, kindly, thinking he's checking in on someone who needed the help. Some holidays he almost says something. He never quite does. None of this required Dale to start ahead of anyone. He was renting a studio apartment at 24 with student loan payments that took a real bite out of every paycheck. He didn't inherit the $630,000 or the instinct that built it. He built the habit first, slowly, back when the habit was the only thing he actually had control over, long before there was any money to prove it was working. Back at the block party, Greg is still telling the hotel story. Dale is listening, nodding, genuinely interested, not performing humility, just actually not thinking about his own account at all right now. Nobody at that party could tell you which one of them just crossed $600,000 this month. That's not an accident. That's the whole system working exactly as intended. There's a version of this same math playing out for both of their kids, too, though neither man has ever sat his kids down to explain it directly. Greg's daughter is starting to notice that new things show up in the house right around the time something stressful happens at her dad's work, without anyone naming the connection. She's 11 and she's already learned, without being taught, that a hard week sometimes ends with a purchase, the way some households learn that a hard week ends with a specific meal or a specific silence instead. Dale's son doesn't have a name for what he's noticed either. Just a general sense that money conversations in his house are short, calm, and rare, which is its own kind of lesson delivered without a single lecture. He's 9, and the first time he ever saw his father visibly frustrated about money was over a parking ticket, not a bill, because the bills never seem to register as anything worth a reaction. 20 years from now, when both kids are adults dealing with their own first real financial stress, it's a fair bet which household's instinct they'll reach for without thinking. Not because either father sat them down and explained the plan, but because kids absorb the emotional temperature of money long before they understand the numbers behind it. Greg's daughter will probably feel a pull toward the purchase that fixes the feeling. Dale's son will probably feel a pull toward silence and a spreadsheet. Neither of them chose that. It just arrived, the way an accent arrives from thousands of ordinary evenings neither kid will specifically remember. There's something almost unfair about how invisible this all is from the outside, and it's worth sitting with that unfairness for a second instead of rushing past it. Dale doesn't get credit at the block party. Nobody claps for the automatic transfer. Nobody notices the 11 years of quietly declined upgrades. Nobody at that party is ever going to know what actually happened this month unless Dale decides to tell them, and he almost certainly never will. The reward for all of it is entirely private, arriving in a number on a screen he doesn't check very often, and in a version of calm that doesn't photograph well and never trends. Back at the party, someone finally asks Dale what he's been up to lately, the polite kind of question that expects a polite, brief answer. He says work's been fine, mentions the weather, asks about their kids instead. The conversation moves on within 30 seconds. Nobody at that gathering will ever know how close they came to hearing the real number, and Dale wouldn't have told them even if they'd guessed close. If any of this is sitting with you, here's one small thing worth trying this week, and it costs nothing and risks nothing. Before your next purchase over $50, just pause and ask yourself one honest question. Is this for me or is this for whoever's going to see it? No right answer, no guilt either way. Just the noticing. That's the whole exercise. If you've ever guessed wrong about someone based on their driveway, subscribe. What happened with Dale's brother was a small crack, one conversation, mostly forgotten by everyone but Dale. Next time, we look at what happens when Greg and Dale's kids grow up next door to each other, and which habit actually gets passed down without either family ever discussing it out loud.